Sporting Kansas City can't rely on Johnny Russell anymore, in my opinion. It's just he's not quite the same player he was, and you got to have multiple options up top.
What is their thinking here? What is so special about LAFC? Yes, they have great games here and there. Yes, they have fantastic performances where they score 4, 5, 6 goals, but they don't do it week in, week out, and that's what you have to do to win an MLS Cup. You have to do it 4 games in a row, or however many games you play in the playoffs. You have to do it every single game. You can't be off your day at all.
I don't think Bob Bradley will retire in his career with an MLS Cup. I do not see it happening.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Supporters Pod. I am Blake, alongside Peyton, as always. We're flying through the episodes, episode 37, and we had a full slate of games on Saturday. A lot of games to talk about. We've got some news outside of the league, some transfers, all that kind of stuff. Peyton, how you feeling?
Well, we're busy. I mean, MLS games have returned. We had no midweek games this past week. You used my quote as the full slate of games. We had the full slate of games this weekend. We're heading into an international break, so we're going to have some World Cup qualifiers. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Obviously, the English League and the European League's taking a break. The MLS continues to chug on in their shortened version of a season, so some teams are going to be without some players, so we'll definitely get to that later in the episode.
Yes, we will. It's going to be interesting. I mean, some of these MLS teams have some good players that go off into their international teams. We talked about it last episode, how they're starting to break into other international teams, not just in the men's national team. So it'll be interesting to see what these guys bring.
It will be, and some teams near the top have several players that are going on this international break and are going to miss 4 or 5 games, especially since they have to quarantine for a few days due to FIFA's regulations before they're able to return to their MLS club. We'll get to the news in a little bit, like I said, but FIFA, there was some controversy over the ruling. The end result is these players that are sent out on the international break to play World Cup qualifiers are going to miss 4 or 5 or sometimes even 6 games for their MLS club, which could be crucial for teams that are on the bubble missing one of their most important players or teams that are fighting the Supporters' Shield.
Yeah, it seems like that would be a very detrimental thing to some teams that are fighting for that, and I don't know why, or it'd be hard because a club wouldn't want to send a player off to international duty because they don't want him to have to miss games for their MLS club, but that's not always up to the player, or not always up to the manager of the MLS club, because the international manager at that point can bring the player, and if the player is willing to play, then it's kind of not, I mean, it's out of the hands of the MLS manager, so that's got to be really tough for some of these managers, because having those players miss that many games, it can be killer to your season.
Yeah, the rocky relationship between club managers and national managers has always been there because a lot of times players are worried, or coaches, managers for club teams are worried about their players going and getting injured. But with the coronavirus, this thing has just been multiplied since leagues like the MLS are forced to play. Now, the MLS normally, in a normal year, does play through international breaks, but it's not in crucial times of the season where they're missing 4, 5, 6 games down the stretch like it is this year. And there's a lot of rockiness in that relationship where the club manager's like, look, in some circumstances it's an international friendly like Mexico, or some circumstances it's the South American CONMEBOL teams that are playing World Cup qualifiers, but it's like, we need our man, he's our number 10 or he's our number 9 or he's a crucial player in our squad and we really need to pick up these points. And the national team manager, his main job is to make sure that all of these players play, that he can put his best squad out there. So when you have those differing interests, you're always going to have some conflict.
And that's where it gets so hard, is the players that are playing for these national teams are the best players on the team in the MLS usually, because if you're good enough to be playing on your international team, you're probably a very, very good player. So it's just that rocky relationship that you always have seen in the past, but like you said, it's definitely multiplied now just because the coronavirus has added so many new things to our lives and to the league that we could have never imagined possible. I know that most managers usually, or it'd be interesting to see conversations with guys like Peter Vermees or guys that have been in the league for a very long time, with their conversation between the international manager and that club manager who's been there for a long time, because I'm sure they've already built up a relationship in the past. So if say Peter Vermees doesn't want Alan Pulido to go be playing in the Mexican national team, I'd love to see that conversation, just because it's more than just a manager to manager. At that point, they know each other on a personal level, probably. So it's got to be an interesting conversation there.
And the player's always stuck in the middle of that conversation throughout their career. And you talk about the Mexican national team, Rodolfo Pizarro for Miami, the Miami head coach, Pizarro, and the Mexican national team head coach all came and talked to the media about how they're going to kind of weather this storm, because Mexico's playing international friendlies, and so Miami, from their perspective, it's like, do we really want to send out our number 10, one of our best players, if not probably our best player right now? He's worked his way into the squad extremely well, one of their DPs. Do we want to send him out for 4 or 5 games when we're right on that playoff bubble in the Eastern Conference, when we could just keep him back at the club and try to keep him from not playing for the Mexican national team just for this break?
Yeah, and it's got to be tough because I'm sure their thought is no, but the international manager always is going to want that player to come and play because they want to field their best squad if they can. And the World Cup's not far away. I mean, we're only a couple years away. So the managers want to start figuring out who is the best player, who can we field, what squad can we field for that World Cup eventually when it comes around. And right now is the time you start doing that.
All right, well, we'll get to the stipulations and all of the regulation that is surrounding this international break, but we have a little bit of news to cover that happened in this past weekend. It happened in this past week in the MLS and in Europe. I want to start in Europe with an article I saw this morning. No matter what you think about the club, Arsenal, Gunnar Soros has been sacked by Arsenal. He has been axed to save costs.
No, Gunnar Soros. I'm not a big Arsenal fan, but that's sad.
That's really sad.
That is sad. He is a icon in the European soccer world. He's one of the biggest mascots. Not biggest. I don't want to be offensive to him. He's not overweight. He's one of the best mascots in the league. I think that he's someone that every Premier League fan knows and just thinks is fun. Obviously, having a mascot like that at the stadium, it's just fun. It's not. There's no. Whether you like him or not, there's no ill intent there. He's just a fun guy to have around the stadium. Adds that little atmosphere. That's sad to hear him go.
Well, he's the most iconic mascot in not just the Premier League, but I think soccer globally. Like, I don't know if there's another mascot or somebody that surrounds a team that's as iconic as Gunnar Soros. He's been there a long time, as long as I've been alive at least. And for him to be leaving, obviously there's no fans in the stadium right now. I would expect they would bring him back once fans get back in the stadium, but of course, it kind of as a meme. I mean, Gunnar Soros is a meme. He became a meme. That's why he's so iconic in the soccer world. I would assume that they'll bring him back and it'll be a big reunion.
And ultimately, this could be a great PR move for Arsenal because when you're, sacking him or whatever you want to call it, it's funny. And everyone gets on board, and they're like, no, we want Gunnar Soros back. And then when fans start coming back in the stadium, they can make a whole big deal about him coming back, and they're reunited and all that PR stuff. So that I think it's a really good move from Arsenal here because obviously you don't need him when there's no fans. So it's ultimately going to end. I'm assuming he'll end up coming back because you can't have Arsenal without Gunnar Soros.
Arsenal's trying to pay Mesut Ozil's wages, but not Gunnar Soros.
Sad for Gunnar Soros.
All right, let's move on to some more serious news. That news was serious and sad, but let's get on to some news that actually impacts play on the pitch. Sergino Dest, an American, went to Barcelona from Ajax. Big high hopes for him for a lot of U.S. men's national team fans. High ceiling. Makes his debut for Barca in a 1-1 draw against Sevilla.
Yeah, Dest is a fantastic player. We've seen it at Ajax. And for the men's national team, he's going to be a very, very good player going forward. We've talked about how this men's national team has so much potential. And 2022 is going to be the time when we start to see that coming together. He's going to be in that squad. I would presume he's going to be in that squad. It would surprise me if he wasn't. But I think it's always tough just hopping into Barcelona is one of the best teams in the world, so it's hard just hopping right into that squad. And I think he's gonna fit his way in. I saw one thing when he first signed. They always do with big players signings. They always do the little signing ceremony where he comes in front of all the fans and they come into the stadium and he does little flicks and tricks and they get cool video of that. And I'm sure he usually would sign jerseys and all that stuff for the fans, but obviously no fans there. And people were kind of, I would say, clowning on him. People were kind of messing with him because he kind of was struggling to do some tricks when he was doing this signing ceremony. But I just thought it was really harsh of people to be clowning on him like they were because he's, first off, a defender, not a guy that's just supposed to be doing flicks and tricks. Also, you can't expect players to be able to just do flicks and tricks. They're not professional skillers. They're professional soccer players. So, and then also, obviously, he's using a ball that is a Barcelona ball, so it's not like it's necessarily the best ball in the world. But I don't want to give too many excuses. I'm sure he's probably upset, but it didn't really matter because this is just such a small thing. And he did have a couple cool little flicks and tricks, but it was funny to see how many people got all over him for something that's so small. It doesn't mean anything about him being a player.
Is Barcelona the only club who does this? Because we seem to get in the news like every time a new player like comes to Barcelona, we see the clips of them juggling the ball or doing a trick. Like, is there other clubs that do
I
this?
think Real Madrid does sometimes, and I think other clubs do for big signings, but it seems like Barcelona is really the big team that does it.
I think Barcelona is kind of the one that is always in the news for introducing a new player, and this is just stupid stuff. Like, this is pretty simple. I want to talk about the actual debut because fans are always going to give footballers or soccer players a hard time on Twitter for every little thing they do, and this has no effect on how he plays. And in the debut for Barca, I think that he played pretty well. He had like 15, 20 minutes, but the model that most U.S. men's national team fans are hoping for, and I'm sure that Barcelona fans are hoping for, is for Dest to make that next step into what Dani Alves was, what Jordi Alba still is, what Nelson Semedo is. Like, it's that kind of attacking style fullback that is able to run for 90 minutes, can overlap those wingers like Messi and all those fantastic players that Barcelona puts up top on the wings, and then also get back and take care of your defensive duties. I think Dest is capable, but he's got a long way to go to reach the caliber of some of the fullbacks at Barcelona that have preceded him, because Barcelona has some of the best fullbacks in the world for a decade and a half, the last decade and a half.
Yeah, and if he can be that player that is a great attacking fullback, can get up the pitch, it's going to be really exciting for the men's national team because they have some great wingers we've seen, like Christian Pulisic. They've got some really, really good wingers up there. So when you have those guys overlapping and just that full-on attack could be just so good and so dangerous, and Dest, I think, will ultimately become that player. He's not there yet, obviously. He's still very young, still definitely developing, but he's showing moments, and I think that he will start to show more moments of just brilliance and being that player, like you said, like some of those guys who have been the guy for Barcelona, been that fullback who's just always been in the squad. He can definitely be that player. It's going to take some time, but he could fall into that spot.
U.S. men's national team, I really want to break it down one day, just the roster from top to bottom, kind of what we're speculating for the next set of friendlies or World Cup qualifiers or whenever the U.S. men are going to be called up next, because it seems like they're just filling more and more positions with all of these young kids that are breaking into Europe. I mean, now we have both fullbacks as Dest and Yedlin probably. We're filling out the midfield with guys like McKinney and Adams who have come onto the scene, and Pulisic's just getting better. I'm still so optimistic and so excited, but we have no results yet.
Hey, we'll get there, and I don't think that you can put too much pressure on them because they're all still young, but we've got, I'm sure, the 2022 World Cup and then the 2026 World Cup are going to be the 2 years where they are fully going for it, fully making runs in those tournaments. So much time to talk about that, so we don't want to get too far into that. But yeah, it's going to be an exciting time.
Let's move it back over to some MLS news. In one of the games we saw this weekend between the Sounders and the Whitecaps, Sounders heavy favorites coming into this game. I thought they played another great game. They have somewhat of an easy schedule riding this season out, just the way that it kind of lined up the teams that they're set to play in the Western Conference. Vancouver, I tipped them for the wooden spoon, have a lot of stuff to work on. This game, what I really want to highlight, it finished 3-1. Like I said, Seattle played a pretty solid game, but the one Vancouver goal is the one that I want to talk about.
Yes, it was a penalty. Really, really iffy call, you have to say. It was, so Ymar, I believe it was, and then who was
Cavallini.
It was Cavallini attacking. And Cavallini was kind of through. Ymar was on his shoulder. They were running shoulder to shoulder. And Ymar, it looked to me like Cavallini kind of shoved Ymar with his shoulder, but then they both kind of fell away from it. Cavallini got into the box, fell over, and it was just such a weird call because on the field, Ymar was shown a red card. It took it to VAR. They changed it. Ymar was given a yellow card, but the penalty stood. What did you think about that?
Well, it was really odd, especially since if you look at the play objectively, regardless of the call made on the field and after VAR, I don't think that's a foul at all. If anything, it's a foul on Cavallini. He initiated the contact against Ymar, and Ymar kind of clipped him with the very back of his heel, and then Cavallini went down. But I thought it was really odd. The call on the field, we'll talk about how bad the VAR decision was in a second, and it was really bad. Like, these are the types of VAR decisions that makes fans of the Premier League hate VAR. It was that bad. But let's talk about the call on the field. Penalty and red card. That's really odd because normally you see a ref give one or the other. They either give the red and then it's a free kick outside the box, or it's a penalty and a yellow. The only time that you see a penalty and a red card is if there was like no attempt to be played on the ball at all. And I don't think that was really the case. So to give both of those in the initial ruling was really odd. I'm not sure how the referee came to that decision at the start. And then you go to look at VAR, and I think most people watching the game thought, okay, they're going to reverse this. It's somewhat clear that Cavallini was the one that initiated a contact. I expected the ref to wave the penalty off, wave the red card off, and a free kick for Seattle most likely. No, the red card was kind of downgraded to a yellow card, which still was extremely harsh. And then the penalty was still given, which, like you said, the challenge didn't really fall into the box. It was odd.
Yes, like you said, with the whole double jeopardy rule, I believe is what it's called. Giving the red card and the penalty is not at all what's supposed to be called on the field. So that was poor. But I guess he did fix that if he thought it was a foul in the box. So whatever. But here's my issue. Like you said, it was Cavallini initiating the contact outside of the box. So let's say you think this was a foul on Ymar, which the referee clearly thought it was a foul on Ymar. I'm sure there could be an argument for it being a foul on Ymar. It was outside of the box. The contact was initiated outside of the box. It did not carry into the box. If anything, Cavallini started falling and then went into the box. So if anything, it's a foul outside of the box. If you want to give the red card, sure, go for it, but it's not a penalty. So a weird call there, a horrible call in my opinion. I think that one would, if he does give a red card and then it's outside of the box, they'd probably go back in the committee or whoever would let Ymar play the next game. But along with that, it just wasn't a foul in my book whatsoever. I thought, like you said, Cavallini initiated the contact. It was a foul on Cavallini in my eyes. Very, very poor call. And I think the thing that frustrates me the most is the fact that it went to VAR and it still was a bad call.
Yeah, that's really frustrating. As an MLS fan, you don't want to see VAR struggle because you have been so far generally as the best league that has implemented VAR. You have been the golden standard of how to implement VAR into your game, and decisions like this set the MLS back. But I want to play devil's advocate for a second here. I absolutely agree with you that in my eyes, the way that I saw the challenge, it's probably a foul on Cavallini, no card for either player. I don't think Cavallini deserved a yellow for that. It was pretty light. But I think what the ref saw is if you ignore the initial contact made by Cavallini onto Ymar or the initial contact outside the box, you ignore that. Ymar inside the box after he was pushed over, essentially, if you ignore that initial contact, he did clip Cavallini with the back of his heel on sort of the back of Cavallini's heel. Now, normally I think if Cavallini wanted to, he still could have stayed on his feet because the contact was like a feather. It was extremely, extremely light. But that contact was in the box, or it was right sort of. It was tough to tell because it was kind of in the air because both feet were in the air, but I think it was inside the box. And I think the ref, his judgment was that initial contact wasn't a foul on either player, but we saw, since it wasn't a foul on either player, Ymar wasn't pushed and as a result of the push hit Cavallini. Ymar was the one who shoulder stuff. Then he was the one that clipped Cavallini inside the box, and then that's why the penalty was given. But that's still really that's going out on a massive limb playing devil's advocate, and I still don't know if I could rationalize that logic for myself.
And here's my thought. Let's say that is what the referee saw, and we'll play devil's advocate. That is the right call. Still very harsh to give a yellow card even, because if you clip someone in the box and it's very unintentional, because it didn't look intentional whatsoever, if that's what he's going to call, you don't give a yellow card for that. It's just a simple foul, and you give the penalty and you move on. So it just seemed very harsh from the referee here, and I don't think it should have been a free kick or it shouldn't have been Vancouver's ball whatsoever. It should have been Seattle's ball. But yeah, even if you're playing devil's advocate, still a little harsh from the referee.
So do we think the MLS is going to rescind that yellow card? Because Ymar is a center back, so I'm wondering if he might accrue 5 yellow cards by the time we get to the playoffs. That could become an important yellow.
I don't know how often they do that, how often they rescind yellow cards. It wouldn't surprise me if they didn't, just because it's a yellow card and they rarely, I don't know, maybe they do that more often, but I don't hear about them doing that.
I don't think it happens much.
Yeah, so I think it'd be very odd if they did that. I think it'll just stand as a yellow card and a poor call, but ultimately didn't affect the outcome of the game whatsoever. Seattle was clearly the better team here. I thought João Paulo's goal was very nice. It was a great strike from outside the box. The keeper could have done better, but I mean, it was a great strike.
Oh man, that João Paulo strike was really sweet. An interesting note from the Whitecaps game, Vancouver started 3 ex-Seattle Sounders players in their lineup. They had Brian Meredith, the goalkeeper. They had Andy Rose in the middle, and then they had Freddie Montero on top.
Maybe hoping those guys would be able to know what Seattle's going to bring out and do it against them, but they clearly weren't.
Clearly didn't help them enough because in reality the result, it could have been 5-0 if Seattle was a little bit more clinical and the ref didn't give that penalty for Vancouver. Vancouver did not have much going forward other than that one chance.
Yeah, there was quite a few chances that Seattle had. I thought a couple headers and just some other chances around the box that they could have put away but weren't able to. So I think going forward, Seattle's going to put some more of those away, and against teams like Vancouver, it's not even going to be a game.
So let's move on to what I thought was probably the most competitive game of the weekend. It was played in East Hartford, Connecticut, which is where Toronto's temporary home site is. Toronto just coming off a win against Columbus in East Hartford, technically the home team still. This week, they have to play Philadelphia. So back-to-back games, playing Columbus at home and then Philadelphia at home for Toronto. Huge tests. And going into this, they had just come off playing a bunch of Canadian teams, and these were the two biggest tests for them in the East. And I had said they didn't have the talent to get it done. They're getting old. They look a step slow. And they went out and played two really, really good games and picked up two victories. So credit to Toronto for proving me wrong.
Hey, I brought it up. We talked about who we thought was going to be able to take the Supporters' Shield, and I said Toronto look like they're making a true run of form right now. They beat Columbus, started moving closer on points to Columbus. Then Columbus drops 2 points they drew against Dallas, who is a very good team. They drew that game. Toronto beating the team below them in Philadelphia, and now they're tied on points for that first place spot in the East. This Toronto team is looking fantastic. We talked about last week who's going to win the MVP. Pozuelo put in another great performance here, scored a goal, and he's really making a name for himself, trying to prove that he deserves that individual trophy. I don't think that's what he's worried about, though. He's worried about getting this team top of the East, winning that Supporters' Shield, and ultimately trying to get them further into the playoffs and eventually an MLS Cup, because they clearly have the talent right now to be able to do that. It's just two great performances from Toronto in the most crucial period of the season, because they're playing two of the top teams in the East, pick up 6 points. Massive for them.
In a temporary home site, too, so it's not really like you're in your home market playing an actual home game, which, how much of an effect does that have on the players? But still, to move into Connecticut and get these two victories, I think it was the first two games at their home site, extremely impressive for them. To echo what we said in the last episode when we were talking about the MVP race, if you haven't already, go back and listen to that. We break down all of the front runners in the MVP race for 2020, but I don't see a way that Columbus wins the Supporters' Shield and Pozuelo doesn't win MVP, barring any massive injury, because he did have another great game. We talked about it in the last episode, but that looks like the route that MLS is probably going to go with the MVP award, since there isn't really any runaways this year. But you talk about Toronto's MLS Cup chances. This is a team, you said just now, that has the potential to potentially make the MLS Cup. How likely is a Part 4 to Seattle-Toronto in the MLS Cup? We saw it in 2016, 17, and 2019.
It really wouldn't surprise me with the way that those two teams are playing right now. They are just two of the best teams in the league right now. And whether Toronto finishes first, second, or third in the East, I would still count them as a team, or even in anywhere. They're still going to be a team that could make this MLS Cup final. And Seattle looks like the team to beat right now in the West. So I don't want to see it, because I always like seeing it changed up. I don't want to see the same teams every year, but I mean, these two teams are just clearly the best teams right now, I think, in their division or in their conferences, respectively.
It feels a little bit like the NBA a few years ago with the Warriors and the Cavs meeting up in the playoffs every year, where no matter how bad they were during the regular season, the Cavs were a 4 seed one year, and I think they were a 5 seed one year. LeBron would always turn it on in the playoffs, and you just knew they were going to make the finals, and they were going to meet, and it was going to be the Warriors and the Cavs. This year is shaping up to be another year where it looks very, very possible. It seemed like after 2018, where Atlanta and Portland were met in the MLS Cup final. Going into 2019, Seattle had dropped off a little bit, looked a little bit older, and LAFC were kind of the new kids on the block, and Toronto was getting a little bit older. People weren't sure how great Pozuelo was going to be. Giovinco left. That signaled the end of this Seattle-Toronto MLS Cup contenders in either conference conversation for part of 2018 and 2019, but incredibly, they both made runs in the 2019 MLS Cup playoffs. They're teams that are experienced, make deep runs all the time. It seems likely.
Yeah, they just know how to do it. They know how to make that deep run, and it doesn't matter where they finish in the league, but it looks like both these teams could finish at the top of their divisions. How often does a 1 seed or the top team in the East play the top team in the West in the MLS Cup final? I don't think that happens too often, so that would be interesting to see. But I mean, these two teams have just dominated the last couple years, and it would not surprise me if it happened again.
So MLS released a graphic this past week, and I don't know if we mentioned it in the last episode, but it was a graphic on their Instagram and Twitter about who's most likely to win the MLS Cup. It was done by 538, and all MLS fans make fun of 538 all the time for their predictions, because it seemed like every match they would predict in the MLS's back tournament in Orlando, they would get wrong. Like, they would predict somebody to win, have a massive chance of being a massive favorite when everybody's like, this game's probably going to be closer than 538 really thinks, and then they were always wrong. It seemed like they were wrong every single match, but the top 4 teams were, I forget what order, but it was like Seattle, Toronto, Columbus, and Philadelphia, and those are probably the best 4 teams in the MLS right now. And the 5th team, I would expect it to be Portland, SKC, Orlando, maybe the Revs.
You could throw Minnesota in there maybe.
I think that's a fair shout. They put LAFC.
I remember you sent me this and you said, hey, look, I think the 538 has done something well this time. And then you go, oh, wait, I just saw the 5th team. Because you looked at the first 4 teams and were like, wow, that actually looks right. And then you realize the 5th team was LAFC. What are they thinking? The 538 just seemed like every time LAFC is the team that they put in there, whether they deserve it or not. It seems like LAFC don't deserve this whatsoever. They've struggled. They're in 5th. They were in 7th, I think, when this was posted. What is their thinking here? What is so special about LAFC? Yes, they have great games here and there. Yes, they have fantastic performances where they score 4, 5, 6 goals. But they don't do it week in, week out, and that's what you have to do to win an MLS Cup. You have to do it 4 games in a row, or however many games you play in the playoffs. You have to do it every single game. You can't be off your day at all.
If you're taking one matchup, like LAFC against any team in the league, you're going to give them a fair probability of winning because they have so many attacking options. They are so clinical on their day. But when you're talking about who's going to win the MLS Cup, which takes depth, it takes consistency, it takes great coaching, it takes health, that's certainly a factor. LAFC doesn't really have those things compared to a lot of other teams that should have been on this list, like Portland, who's super deep, has a great coach, like Minnesota, who's super deep, has a great coach. I think you could throw SKC in that conversation when they get back on form. Polito had a great game this last weekend. There are plenty of teams that I think are better set up to win not just one game, but a string of games heading into the playoffs against good teams than this LAFC team, who seems like a one-and-done team as far as like results go. Like, yeah, they'll blow somebody out in the first round of the playoffs 5-0 when they weren't supposed to, but then they'll turn around the next week and lose 3-0 to a team that isn't really deserving, like we saw them lose to San Jose a week ago.
So are you trying to make the shout that Bob Bradley isn't a manager who's going to be able to lead his team to an MLS Cup?
Bob Bradley is not the manager. I don't think Bob Bradley will retire in his career with an MLS Cup. I do not see it happening.
But I would agree. I would think you would agree with me in saying that he's not. LAFC shouldn't move away from him too quickly.
Not yet. No, I don't think so. I think that's a symptom of a bad franchise who wants to jump ship every time something goes wrong. You have to ride out these rough waves. But I just don't. I think that it's tough. I mean, as an LAFC perspective, as an LAFC supporter, say, I would want to stick with Bob Bradley because of what they had last year, winning the Supporters' Shield, being on fire. And Bob Bradley's proven that this team can be very, very lethal. But I just don't see Bob Bradley as a coach, as a philosophy, the way that he runs the game, as a strategy that's going to succeed in the MLS.
Here's the way I would put it. I think Bob Bradley he's going to be able to get them pretty far and get them into some big games, but never win them an MLS Cup final. But if you fire him and hire a new manager, the issue is there's a small chance you could hire a new guy that's going to be able to do that, win you MLS Cups, but it's a lot more likely that you fall backwards and you start struggling a lot more and falling into the almost irrelevancy. And I think that is the issue, is that they're a lot more likely to fall into that irrelevancy than they are to ultimately win a couple MLS Cups or even just an MLS Cup.
Let's talk about Brenden Aaronson now, the number 10 for Philadelphia. He doesn't wear number 10, but he plays number 10 on the pitch, that center attacking mid-role. He's been the main playmaker for Philadelphia throughout this whole year. There's been lots of rumors. We've talked about it before, potentially going to the Bundesliga or Austria. It's confirmed. He is going to Salzburg, RB Salzburg, in January, so he's going to finish out the year with Philadelphia. So I'm sure that all of Philadelphia is like, this is the run. This is the year, because as soon as they lose him, they lose a lot of their lethality going forward. Brenden Aaronson, I'm going to be sad personally, not going to be able to see him next year in the MLS.
We've talked about it. I mean, he is a great player in this league. We love watching him, but it was bound to happen. And this is a good move for him personally, because Salzburg are great at developing players. We've seen it. It's a good step up, but not a massive step up, so he'll be able to slowly work his way into that squad, become a good player, and ultimately I think his goal is to move into a bigger European club that is playing in big games. Obviously, Salzburg plays in the Champions League sometimes,
I was just
so
gonna say.
That's huge for him. If he's able to play in some of those games, then when he eventually does move to a better squad, I don't want to be too harsh on Salzburg, but there are plenty of better teams in the whole realm of the world. In Europe, there are plenty of better teams, so if he's able to take that next step to the highest level, he'll already have that experience in some big Champions League games, and he'll be able to just jump right in. I think he is on the right path right now, and hopefully we can see him playing for this men's national team and ultimately come back to the MLS maybe someday.
I was going to say he's got to be a national team prospect at this point, a guy that Berhalter's going to at least think about putting into his squad. And going to Austria, I think if he adapts to the play over there, that's the real teller. If you're able to adapt to the play in Europe, in that style, that because it's different than the MLS. It's a higher tempo. And especially playing those Champions League games, I'm sure going to RB Salzburg, he will get opportunities. He'll go in, be a key player of the squad, I would have to assume, going straight in. Being young with that high ceiling, Salzburg will want to train him as much as they can to get up to that level where they can sell him, because that's ultimately what he's using RB Salzburg as a stepping stone to get higher in his career. RB Salzburg looking to turn a massive profit on him. So Philadelphia are going to get their payday. RB Salzburg now going to be the next club that tries to develop him and get their payday. But you're absolutely right. Best move for the player, and I wish him the best, and I hope to see him in the national team in 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, and if we're talking MLS terms, do you think that this is Philadelphia's last run? Do you think they're going to struggle after he leaves? And do you think that this needs to be the year for Philadelphia?
I think Philadelphia will go back to being sort of what they were in 2019, which is a solid MLS playoff team. Last year they got knocked out. Did they move past the Red Bulls? I know they played the Red Bulls in the first round. I'm not sure who moved past, but they were either knocked out in the first or second round. Philadelphia are very strong defensively. They have Andre Blake. They have a very solid back line. But it was just going forward. They have Sherbilko. They have Sergio Santos. So there's still a core around Philadelphia, and they're still going to be a good team. I just don't know if they have that dynamite anymore without Aaronson to be able to score enough goals against teams that are like Toronto or like Columbus in the East that are able to lock games down when they have to.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think Philadelphia are a team that if they don't do it this year, if they don't make a big run in the MLS playoffs and ultimately win an MLS Cup, it's not going to happen for a little while. They're going to have to rebuild slightly, and it's going to take some time because they don't have any flashy players that are going to go out and do anything, except for guys like Brenden Aaronson, obviously Andre Blake as well. I think he's a great player. But yeah, I think Aaronson is a key piece to this squad, and once they lose him, it's going to take some time to rebuild and get their feet back under them because he's been such a huge part to the squad.
So this isn't just about Aaronson, but a general point about the playoffs in general for 2020. Coming into this year, we've talked about it before on the podcast, that the West was going to be a dogfight. And in reality, a lot of the big dogs in the West that we saw have kind of dropped off. I mean, we expected SKC to be a little bit stronger at this point in the year. We expected LAFC to be a lot stronger. LA Galaxy, you could probably make that argument. Portland losing Blanco's a different team. Heading into the playoffs right now, the East is probably going to be a lot more entertaining than the West, because I didn't expect this many teams in the East to shine against that many teams in the West. And right now, I would say that the Eastern Conference as a whole is probably stronger than the West right now, because the West has Seattle and Portland's not lagging far behind, but it seems like a lot of those teams like LAFC that we expect to be near the top dropped off just a little bit compared to what we thought was going to happen, when in the East you have Orlando and the Revs, who are very capable of hanging with those top three teams of Toronto, Columbus, and Philadelphia. It's going to be really fun to watch these Eastern Conference playoffs. There's a lot of great teams in that mix.
I'd have to agree, but I think the difference between the East and the West is the West, the bottom clubs, I'd say the bottom, 4, 5 clubs are just, I'd say, quite a bit further, or maybe not 5, maybe the bottom 4 clubs are just quite a bit further down. I think they're not as good nearly as, there's a couple teams in the West that aren't as good, but the East, definitely, those bottom clubs are a bit more bottom feeders. So I think the East are able to pick up more points, so those top teams look better. But ultimately, I think the top of the East and the top of the West are very similar. And I think it's going to be interesting when they eventually come to get to play each other in the final. But yes, the Eastern Conference, those top teams are fantastic to watch. It's going to be such a good playoff. I don't think the East is going to be the only spectacular playoff, so I think the West there's going to be some good games in there that you don't necessarily expect.
Yeah, there's going to be good games on both sides, but is that necessarily true? I mean, the West does have Vancouver and San Jose that these teams at the top are always capable of beating up on, and in the East you have that equivalent in Miami or now Atlanta in some aspects. So is it in DC? I would say after this weekend,
DC, and I'd even throw Cincinnati or Chicago into that.
Yeah, but even those teams at the top are all going to be in that conversation of reaching that 9th and 10th spot in the East, because so many teams make the playoffs. But you kind of have those even bottom feeders at the end. I wouldn't say that necessarily San Jose and Vancouver are that much better, that much worse than the bottom few teams, DC, Atlanta, Miami in the East.
Yeah, but I just feel like some of the teams at the bottom of the West, like Houston or even RSL or Colorado, who are struggling right now, they're pretty good. But also that does come down to the fact that the Eastern Conference has more teams, so they're bound to have more not as good teams, I guess you could say.
Diversity and
exactly.
talent.
Exactly. So there's not a whole lot to it, I would say. I'm kind of making a argument that's not going to go very far because there's really not a whole lot to it. But ultimately, these playoffs, I can tell you, I am so excited for this year. We've got plenty of time till then, but I just think that it's going to be a very, very good run of playoffs.
Yeah, we can keep speculating in every episode for the next 6 or 7 weeks. I think the playoffs or the regular season ends in November 8th or something, so we have plenty of time to speculate and watch the Supporter Shield race. Everybody bounce back and forth as Toronto beats teams like Philadelphia. But let's move on to our final topic of the day that we wanted to talk about. We said we'd get to it, is the international duty, the international regulation. So Peru's players, including Raul Ruiz Diaz of the Sounders and Pedro Gallese of Orlando City, they have taken off. So there was a lot of controversy whether these players would be able to leave or whether MLS clubs would force them to stay. They allowed them to go. So Orlando City and Seattle are going to be without those players for 4 or 5 match days. It's only the South American nations that are playing, the North American nations. Mexico's playing some friendlies, but the U.S. men and the Canadian men are not playing any matches. So it mostly is on all of these teams that have a bunch of South American players. LAFC would potentially be impacted. They have Rossi and Rodriguez, probably their 2 best players up top at this point, both in Uruguay's squad. And so we're not sure how Uruguay is going to narrow down that 23-man roster. The Galaxy could potentially lose Pavone to Argentina. It's going to be interesting.
Definitely going to be very interesting. I think that missing players like Raul Ruiz Diaz and Gallese are huge pieces to these squads. So it's gonna make for an interesting outcome. I think it's going to help some of the teams that don't have players that are going off. But it seems like most of these top teams have at least 1 or 2 players going off into the international teams. So is it harmful to every team? Or if it is harmful to every team, is it really harmful to any team? I don't know. It might be more harmful to some teams, but I think ultimately it's going to be helpful for some of the teams that are struggling maybe to get up into those playoff spots that don't really have any players going on to international break. They might be able to pick up a point or maybe even 3 points against a team they aren't expecting to because they're missing players and they're not able to get it done. This is where the MLS, I've really always not necessarily disagreed or always had a struggle with, I think, is that when players go off on international break, they tend to miss more games than you see in Europe. Most times in Europe, they have breaks in their league because they don't want players missing for international break, also because there's so many players that play on the international teams over in Europe. But I just think it's tough for the MLS it's almost like a choice of, do you want to play for your national team or do you want to play for your MLS club? And I don't think it should be that way. I almost think the MLS should make breaks more clear, but obviously the pandemic has mixed everything up and they can't really do that this season. So it's just a very interesting dynamic this season.
Yeah, it's a whole nother argument of whether the MLS should take breaks during its season. MLS operating on that March to November schedule. Most leagues in Europe and most top leagues around the world operate on that August to April schedule. So there's going to be a lot of international breaks in that summer break period between April and August when those clubs aren't playing games. That's the middle of the MLS season. MLS has some decisions to make, and it's difficult because if you're going to block out 2 weeks at a time, multiple times throughout your season, it's going to be difficult to keep the continuity, form. You're going to have big breaks necessarily when you wouldn't if you were a team in Europe or in a league in Europe per se. But let's talk about what teams are getting hit hardest, because I don't think all of the teams have South American players. It's not like the U.S. men are going. It's not like all national teams, all of these small Caribbean nations, which take players from, it seems like almost every team in the MLS, because all of the best exports from those smaller nations seem to make it into the MLS. It's just specific teams. LAFC will get hit hard, I think, without Rossi and Rodriguez, and LA Galaxy would miss Pavone a lot. I think those 2 teams would probably be hit among the hardest.
Do you think Seattle's going to be missing Ruiz Diaz? Do you think that'll be a big hit to them?
Possibly. I think Will Bruin, we definitely seen a resurgence in. I did not think that Will Bruin, after going down with that ACL injury, would make it back into the squad because he's getting older. He's getting up there, 31, 32. Morris and Ladero and Jovan Jones are probably going to have to pick up a little bit of that striker force. I mean, missing Ruiz Diaz is going to be huge, but Seattle doesn't have that hard of a schedule going down the stretch. They get to play some of those lower-end Western Conference teams. I think they play Vancouver at least 1 or 2 more times. They play San Jose. They get RSL, Colorado. I think they might play Portland once, but they get to avoid the LA teams, which can be very dangerous on their day. They get to avoid Portland for the most part. They get to avoid Minnesota and SKC, which are also very good teams in the West. So it'll be interesting. I don't know how much of an effect it'll have on Seattle just because of their schedule and because they have so many capable players up top, and Will Bruin's been doing well. But who's going to fill into that spot for LAFC? Like Bradley Wright Phillips can't really get it done for 90 minutes. El Munir, he's shown flashes. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but a team that I know that I think will be hit hard is Sporting Kansas City, because Pulido, when he came back, they looked great against Houston. He scored, I think he scored both goals, it was just a great performance from him against Houston for Sporting Kansas City. And Sporting Kansas City needed him, because when he was gone, they did not look nearly as good. He was the guy who could get it done. Johnny Russell had to step in, and he was scoring lots of goals, but he wasn't quite as good. I just feel like Sporting Kansas City were not nearly as good without him. So I think they're going to be taking a big hit there.
Yeah, they were dropping a lot of points that they probably shouldn't have when Pulido was gone. Johnny Russell did play well during that stretch, but Sporting Kansas City can't rely on Johnny Russell anymore, in my opinion. It's just he's not quite the same player he was. And you got to have multiple options up top for the same reason like we talked about last week with Rossi. Going into games, defenses, fullbacks are going to specifically man-mark Rossi. When Rossi and Vela are both in there, then you have to watch both of them. If there's just one option up top, you can try to man-mark him, close him down. So, I don't know.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting finish to the season, and I think that this international break is going to mix things up for sure. It could knock some teams off the top, but I guess we'll have to wait and watch.
We will. There will be plenty of things shaken up with all of these players leaving, so I would not be surprised to see some of these teams, like potentially Seattle, SKC, both LA teams, maybe Orlando losing Gallese, because he has been really an important piece in a lot of their victories. He's made some great saves late on in games.
He has. I think that is about all we've got. I don't know. Do you got anything else, Peyton?
I think that's good for me.
Sweet. So if you guys are not in touch with us, make sure to stay in touch with us on Instagram at the.supporters.pod or on Twitter at supporterspod, and also our new YouTube channel, The Supporters Pod. We've got everything on there for video form. So if you want to watch us, not just listen to us audio form, you can watch us in video form. And same the other way around. If you are a video watcher on our YouTube channel, check out our Spotify or our Google or our their Apple Podcasts or
anywhere
any audio form.
Anywhere you get your podcast. If you're an Apple Podcast listener, be sure to rate the podcast. It always helps us out. And if you like listening to us because you're still listening now, be sure to tell your friends about it. We're trying to expand.
Yes, we are trying to expand. Spread the word. The Supporters Pod moves forward, and hopefully we can grow the podcast overall. So thank you guys for listening.